Hey legends, and welcome back to the least knowledgeable sim racing channel, where we're taking a dive back through time to uncover a diamond in the rough. Assetto Corsa could arguably be called the first true simulator I ever drove. Up until then, I had strictly driven in dirt rally, whose simulation value left a little to be desired if we're being kind. Being into motorsport strictly as a rally fan for the majority of my life, I didn't find much reason to venture into the asphalt-based simulators, but the name kept coming up and I found myself with a trusty Thrustmaster T500 RS and thought, why not really put it up to the test? And put it to the test I did. My first drive in AC could kindly be described as a slow-motion disaster. I picked a club variant of some track I don't even recall to get a simple loop layout and get to grips with the game's handling. Being ever the dipstick, I had to do this with a modern supercar, at the time being the McLaren MP4-12C. As someone who was solely used to driving simulation from the vantage point of a superbly balanced SimK WRC car, making the shift into a heavy road car was quite something. After discovering the difference between what my mind thought braking points were and what they actually were, generally separated by around 100 meters or so, I realized that I had absolutely no feel for the driving experience. After trying repeatedly with some very mediocre results for a couple of days, I retired the game. I wasn't particularly great no matter which car or track I raced. My sim racing exploits continued with the release of Project Cars 2. Being the first game where I felt like I was, quote, driving on actual rubber, made it far easier for me to feel the limits of the car and what I could do with it. My driving was still far from stellar, but I was committed to stick with it this time and see it through. With the help of the forum community, the time trial leaderboards, and the Nürburgring Nordschleife being broken up into 3 digestible sectors for me to learn, I put my head down and got to work. After a few days of steadily improving, albeit still largely mediocre results, I was finally taught the mythical technique of trail braking. Realizing that this was something I intuitively did in my car in real life, but had always thought was technically incorrect, created one of those facepalm moments where you realize you wasted so many years that could have instead been spent refining a useful technique. In fact, I had done everything I could to eradicate trail braking from my technique while simming, as I was always instructed that all braking should be done in a straight line. Once the trail braking sunk in and I spent a few days committing the technique into my muscle memory, things began to make sense. As the Nordschleife's layout coalesced in my mind, my time started reaching the top 20 on the leaderboards, then the top 10, then the top 3, and then finally culminated in the number of firsts. During this time, my great affinity for and familiarity with the Nürburgring Nordschleife was entrenched. I'd occasionally jump back and forth between project cars and AC, but could never translate that same driving feel to AC. It always felt numb, unresponsive, with curb behavior that just felt bizarre. I always took the entirety of the blame for this and just assumed I wasn't very good at virtual driving. That was until one fated day where I first tried R-Factor 2. I still remember the first drive clear as day. It was in the ISI Civic on the ripped version of the Nordschleife that I found on internationalsimracing.com. Being introduced to the game through its ubiquitous menu, which many of you would be familiar with, and seeing the aged graphics didn't exactly inspire me about what was going to follow. In fact, I had absolutely no expectation for the mind-blowing experience I was going to have through my first Sector 1 run of the Nordschleife. The very first sensation I experienced was actually feeling the granularity of the road surface for once. It felt like there was an actual sense of friction beneath the model tire and the road surface. I immediately understood that the car was a front-wheel drive vehicle based on the fantastic rendering of torque steer, if the Civic badge didn't give it away at first. Needless to say, my first laps in R-Factor were at a competence level far higher than I thought I was capable of. It was at this point that I realized what I'd always been responding to was a fundamental lack of completion of Assetto Corsa's driving model. It wasn't SimC'd enough to be accommodating to a newbie, but it also didn't simulate enough variables nor provide enough feedback to double back as an analog to real driving. so I had absolutely no reference point with which to tackle it. It was in that no man's land between simcade and simulation. Following this experience, as many of you would know, rFactor 2 became my dominant sim, and Assetto Corsa left my hard drive for some years. I dabbled with and tested ACC during its development process, but it never struck a chord with me, and it always felt like a fundamental regression in its driving model compared to what I was used to in rFactor. Kunos have obviously added to that simulation vastly in the years since early access and turned it into a very formidable sim now. The reason I'm going over this story is so that you understand my sim racing trajectory, and it hopefully sheds some light on what I'm going to talk about now, my long overdue return to Assetto Corsa. With the release of the insanely ambitious Soul mod a while back, Assetto Corsa popped up on everybody's radar again. For those like myself who always felt the game looked off no matter which post-processing filter was used to render the graphics, Soul and its complementary custom shaders patch fixed all the major visual issues by actually neutralizing the color balance and creating a very deep cinematic contrast grading. Not to mention it added variable time of day, an assortment of weather conditions, and the ability to run legitimate endurance races in AC. This is the kind of update that most sim racing developers would use to stick a number 2 next to the title and sell it all over again, but instead it came out as a free update. This alone is a testament to the strength of Assetto Corsa's modding scene, and arguably the one factor which has kept the simulator alive well beyond its protracted lifetime. In fact, the game came out around the same time as rFactor 2, but looking at them both now, you wouldn't be able to tell. With Soul and custom shaders, Assetto Corsa can look unbelievable. Being armed with a brand new, direct-driven simulator rig thanks to the people at Next Level Racing and Fanatec, and with the recent Fanatec driver update essentially revolutionizing the way my wheelbase felt, I couldn't help but decide a long-awaited return to AC was warranted, if not outright demanded by all the people shouting in my comment section. I wanted to make sure that I gave AC one last fair shot, using high-end gear this time with absolutely no excuse or cop-outs on my behalf. I am, after all, a vastly more competent virtual driver now than I was years ago, thanks largely to rFactor 2. The group of friends who enticed me to try AC again are a bunch of VR fanatics who love the Mazda MX-5 Cup car, so naturally, that was my first port of call, the MX-5 at Laguna Seca. No longer needing to fiddle with LUT files and an array of settings tweaks to get the force feedback feeling right, I simply enabled everything, used Fanatec's recommended settings, and the additional gyroscopic forces tweak that custom shaders patch adds, and went for it. To say that the driving experience was easy and intuitive would be to undersell it. The game immediately felt like a somewhat scaled-back version of ACC in terms of its feedback. Self-aligning torque forces were very good, and I could correct for oversteer without any issue. The road detail, while still comparatively vague to rFactor 2, was detailed enough to let me know when I was on a curb and reaching track limits. Now, while the MX-5 Cup could possibly be the easiest car to drive in all of sim racing, I could tell that my old musings of incomplete simulation were still valid. The game was very fun to play with certain cars. The MX-5 Cup was like a brain-off lapping machine that was impossible to overdrive, whereas the Porsche 962C was riveting and fun in that seat of your pants, trying not to get wheel spin in third gear while going 150 km/h kind of way. However, I couldn't leave it there. With the grounds of GT cars being very well represented by both ACC and rFactor 2, I had to do some direct comparisons. The first was the Porsche 911 Rsr Gte. The AC model of this car is just weird. It lacks connection to the road and slides way too much. The moment I compared it to rFactor 2, I knew that my original decision to drop AC because of its incomplete overall simulation for the sake of my driving was the correct move. This experience was echoed by comparing AC to ACC. Trying the Cayman GT4 across both games was kind of surreal. Many of those missing elements I referred to from AC now actually exist in ACC, so the experience of driving the GT4 was not only more nuanced, but more engaging and fun, not to mention less forgiving. To that end, I once again have to give props to Kunos for continually working to improve their simulation, something you can very easily experience for yourself by simply comparing their games to each other. AC seems to exist in that space between rFactor 2 and Automobilista 2. It's nowhere near as wacky and not dialed in as Automobilista 2, but it's also not as nuanced and complete as rFactor 2 is. The fundamentals of the cars feel about right. The self-aligning torque forces are good and give you the necessary feedback to correct for slip, but it about ends there. I can see myself keeping it installed to play in some quick lobbies with friends and have some carefree fun. I would not, however, use it as training for real driving. That aside, the transformation that Solar's made to the game is unbelievable. I always felt that the AC engine was remarkably detailed, especially in regards to the cars themselves, and this new color grading and shading finally allows that to be showcased. During this video, I've been playing clips of an MX-5 race at Brands Hatch. This one is poetic because it represents my first ever race against AI in AC, done on my drive back in the game after 2 years of absence. I went from barely being able to complete an oval lap without smashing up the car, to taking on a field of AI set to a variability of 3% within 95%, and easily overcame them to take the victory in my first race back in the simulator. On one hand, it's a testament to the lasting value of AC as a sim, and also the community's additions to the force feedback model. And on the other hand, it's a testament to all the instructive value that rFactor has had in my life. Because the difference between barely being able to finish a lap to chewing up a field of jacked up AI in a game with only 2 races apart isn't a small one to overcome. I'm happy to look back and say that AC is a game I undervalued. While it's not going to become my dominant simulator or a stand-in for my driving practice, I have huge respect for its value as a casual sim racing title to be enjoyed with friends, or simply to call up any track or car combination you can think of thanks to the amazing community support over the years. In fact, I'm actually considering to start a semi-regular Nordschleife Touristenfahrten series in a private lobby with you guys. Just some casual, chilled driving on the Nordschleife as one would have done in times prior to a global lockdown. Let me know what you guys think about that down below. In the meantime, make sure to hit the sub to stay up to date with future sim racing content, and if you're interested in any of the sim racing gear I spoke of in this video, all the links are in my description down below. Until next time, I'll see you guys later.